Who's Director of Climate Infrastructure Investments. All right, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Sorry for the short delay. My name is Ben Newell. I'm the Director of the Institute for Climate Risk and Response here at UNSW. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Bedjigal people. They're the traditional custodians of this land, and I also pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. So this is a talk in our ICRR seminar series. We cover various different topics, quite diverse topics. And I'm delighted today that we're going to have a presentation by two speakers. I'm not quite sure how they're going to do the distribution of labour, but we've got two speakers. First is Eliza Northrup, and Eliza is the Director of the UNSW Centre for Sustainable Development Reform, which is within the Faculty of Law and Justice. She's an international environment lawyer specialising in climate change and ocean governance. Before joining UNSW, she helped establish the High-Level Panel for Sustainable Ocean Economy, a group of 18 serving heads of state and government. She's published extensively on multilateral treaty design, supported governments in developing national climate commitments, and established global coalitions on decarbonisation. She holds an LLM in environmental law from NYU, an MBA from the University of South Australia, LLB with honours from the University of Adelaide, and a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies from the University of Adelaide. And she's admitted to the New York Bar. It's an impressive list of qualifications. Other speaker is Angelique, I'm not going to... Pupano, who I've just met, who is currently visiting UNSW. Angelique is a lawyer from the Seychelles, holds an LLM in environmental law, specialising in the law of the sea and natural resources law. She's currently pursuing a PhD investigating an enabling legal environment for the sustainable ocean economy in SIDS. She's the Chief of Staff to the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Climate Action and Just Transitions. She previously served as a policy and strategy advisor on ocean and climate matters to the chair of the Alliance of Small Island States, and prior to that held the position of Chief Executive Officer of the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust. In 2021, the New African magazine recognised her as one of the 100 most influential Africans. Angelique's worked in different countries in the Caribbean, Pacific, Indian Ocean on a wide range of projects relating to sustainable fisheries and sustainable management of marine biodiversity within and beyond national jurisdiction, and she serves on the advisory board of the UN Ocean Decade. So I think the combined expertise here is really quite phenomenal. And they're going to talk to us about climate diplomacy, Australia's potential role in shaping the future of the UNFCCC. Over to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And apologies again that we were late. The law building is down the bottom of campus, and embarrassingly, despite working on climate, this is my first time up visiting the institute, so we got a little bit lost. So apologies for that. So it's always a bit daunting when you hear your actual bio read out. But essentially, I think Angelique and I are both climate nerds in a legal sense, which is why today we're just going to talk through some aspects of climate diplomacy, which is very much the world that both of us have worked in for quite a long time, and the UNFCCC. So I think it's, I haven't been to some of these other seminars, but I think judging from some of the bios, they're perhaps a little bit more academic in nature. We're not going to be talking about research per se, but the political world of the UNFCCC, and sort of having a little bit of fun with that. And in terms of how we're presenting it, it's one whole presentation, but we're sort of splitting it into it and tackling different aspects of that. And I think the relevance, this was in the bio, of why we're talking about this is the UNFCCC and COPs and the role of COP presidencies and climate diplomacy has really been more relevant to Australia of late, because there's been obviously a lot of talk for a few years now about Australia's bid to host an upcoming COP, COP 31, initially COP 29, but then we pushed it out a couple of years. So we're now looking at COP 31. So we thought this was kind of a topical time, particularly as we're heading into the second half of this year and looking to COP29, which is being hosted in Azerbaijan, where we're expecting a decision to be taken on whether Australia has won its bid or not. And if it has, what that means, I think, for the Australian climate community. So that's a little bit of the framing and relevance for today's talk. Who has been to a COP? Good. Okay, so hopefully I'm not talking about stuff that you guys already know really well. So just very quickly to set the scene on Australia's COP31 bid. This all started back in 2021. Scott Morrison was Prime Minister. I think everyone knows his track record on climate change. He was not expected or likely to go to the UK's COP that was being held in Glasgow, COP26. This is a bit of a memory test for me as I talk about all the COPs and look to Angelique for reference on the numbers. COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. The UK, the COP president, exerted, I think, a lot of diplomatic pressure to get the Australian PM there. He got there, is getting on the plane, I think, and announced that Australia was actually going to come forward with a 2050 net zero. So Australia actually kind of coming a little bit into play around decarbonisation there. I think in response to that a little bit, the opposition leader at the time, Anthony Albanese, I think a week or so later, said that if his government takes charge, that they'll actually put their hand up to actually host one of these. So like we can do one better than what the then government was putting forward. So I think that's very much the start of it. As I mentioned, they were talking about hosting COP29, which is actually taking place this year for many reasons that I won't go into. It was a different regional groupings allocation. They decided to not push for that and go for COP31 instead. When I talk about a COP, I keep using the acronym. International environmental lawyers love acronyms. It's the conference of the parties to the UNFCCC. So it's the 190 plus countries that have signed on to the UNFCCC that meet annually. For most of the last 29 years, that has very much focused on sort of negotiating legal text, treaties. Obviously, the Paris Agreement came out of that, the Kyoto Protocol before that. But COPs are now much more than that government-led negotiation process. They are huge. I'll talk about that a little bit in a sec, but when we talk about COPs, it is obviously that government-led process, that sort of strict negotiation, parties behind their flags in the room, but it's also the private sector, the NGOs, the IGOs, the community groups, sort of everyone that comes together to talk about climate and advance climate issues for that particular year. And always hosted by a COP presidency that really sets the tone for that year. And I think I mentioned this. It's not, in terms of Australia's bid, I suppose just going back to this, this is the first time that obviously Australia has ever bid or ever expressed interest in hosting COP. And it would really be the only time a COP has been hosted if we're successful within the region. COPs are hosted on sort of a 5-year cycle, if you like, where every different regional grouping, according to the UN regions, so Africa, Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, Eastern Europe and Western Europe and others. And we're the others in the Western Europe, alongside Canada, New Zealand, the US, like truly others, fall into that category. So every 5 years, a country of one of those regional groupings puts their hand up, and then it's up to that regional grouping to decide who gets to host the COP that year. So Australia is going up against Turkey. And why it's so disparate is because technically Australia is in the group with Turkey. So that's our competitor. Switzerland, I'll mention this a bit later as well, but Switzerland had also put their hand up and they stepped back. So that's kind of the mix of countries for COP31 and why it's quite interesting, but Australia's part of that, that interesting regional group. And it's very much a diplomatic exercise as to who actually is successful in that COP bid, lots and lots of factors. but every country within that bid, and I think our group has 28 from memory, has veto power. So it's a mini negotiation within a much broader negotiation process. So that's kind of what's been happening for the last couple of years and why it's taking so long, because Australia really has to fight for that process and then has to be successful within the much broader political maneuverings of that group. But we should know at the end of this year, hopefully. Typically, it's about 2 years. So why is a COP? Why does it matter? Why are we bidding? Why does this all matter? Somewhat of a topical reference, and I think many people have made this drawn this comparison before, is the Olympics. It's like the climate Olympics for those that follow. And it's the similar kind of, when you talk about countries planning in advance and putting their bids in and really wanting to host these global sporting events like the Olympics, it's not dissimilar for the COP process. It's incredibly resource intensive. It's really expensive. The venues are huge. When we talk about COPs, historically 20 to 30,000, but COP28 last year in UAE, I think got to very close to 100,000, 90 to 100,000, which is huge. And again, I'll talk to this a little bit more in a sec, but they're big events and they can really shape the domestic policy agenda, the regional and the international policy agenda for quite some time. Just go through. So to dig into what these look like a little bit more, Angelique is going to cover in sort of second half of this what goes on in the negotiating room a little bit more formally, the maneuverings, the tactics, the strategies, the reality of being in country negotiations in a climate policy and political context. So I'm going to talk a little bit more to what happens outside that room and what these 30,000 to 90,000 people actually do for 2 weeks in their destination, and some of the ways that I think the structure and the dynamic of these 2 weeks really inform some of the outcomes or lack of outcomes. Pulling my notes so I don't forget anything. So this marketplace analogy, I think I've stolen from Howard Bamsey. I've heard him talk about this before and I really like it. Howard Bamsey is an ex-change ambassador for Australia, also the executive director of the Green Climate Fund for a long time, and really an expert in this space. And he sort of likened it to a marketplace, which I like because it's very similar. I think you can easily go in to the COP like a marketplace. If you don't know what you want, what you need, you can get lost, get overwhelmed, end up buying things you don't need, come out. And the whole exercise was largely futile but exhausting. And I think COPs are very similar. And I think that is the experience of a lot of people that go to COPs, is you hit this crowd, this sea of people with all these different events and zones and tents and pavilions and ways of interacting and all the different topics that are covered. And it can be overwhelming and really, really hard to navigate. And I think that's only getting more so as the climate crisis worsens, and what is covered in these COPs is more complicated and more what they need to cover is more all-encompassing. And I think I said this, but it's 190 plus, I can't remember the exact number, 190 plus countries are represented here, which is quite phenomenal. In terms of the way they're structured, there is a blue zone and a green zone in a way. That's sort of the high level structure. Blue zone is where the negotiations take place and where the governments mostly spend most of their time. And the green zone is something that's evolved over time as climate has been taken out of the realms of just government action and the value of the private sector in particular, but also, you know, civil society, IGOs, community groups, youth, you name it. Their value to the climate movement has been more and more important. There was a need to create other zones within this climate conference structure to bring their contributions to the fore. And I should say, we keep talking about conference. This is not like a conference like you would go to for any other topic. There is no common structure. There's no, common agenda, lunchtime breaks, or, I mean, there is, but it's mayhem. It's a common place where everyone sort of comes together. And I think this is sort of one of my last points, but I want to touch on it with the zoning, is the structure of spaces can be really critical to the success and critical to how people can navigate this world that is created over this 2 weeks. Some countries, when they've hosted, personally, I always go to Paris, COP21. The layout, and these are huge spaces, obviously, to accommodate 1,000 people, but the layout was very carefully crafted to make sure that the government negotiators, and this is where Paris really came together and was adopted, so crucial, but the country negotiators really had to navigate the space. They had to move through elements of, not the green zone per se, but elements where there were outside influences and outside side events happening on their way to negotiations. There was lots of breakout spaces. There was lots of informal spaces for discussions, for negotiations. It was easy to navigate. There was lots of food. There was lots of water. It was signposted well. This sounds like logistics, but I think it was crucial to the negotiating process and achieving the outcomes that were achieved, because the negotiators going through that process were very aware of what was happening in those outside spaces. They're aware of what NGOs were saying, what civil society was saying, what the media was saying. They had informal opportunities to get input through that process. They had the spaces to have the huddles on technical issues. I think one other example, again, sort of my personal experience, is when Fiji hosted, we couldn't come to Fiji, obviously, so Bonn, the UNFCCC headquarters, offered to host. Fabulous. It was a great COP, actually, but in terms of the structure of how that blue and that green zone was structured, they were miles apart from each other with a long, thin tunnel connecting them. And I think that was kind of, I don't think it was meant to be this way. I think it was the space constraints, but it meant that operating within that space, the governments had no connection to what was going on in the rest of the climate discussions. They often couldn't make side events. They couldn't speak to a more broad audience because they couldn't make the 10 to 15 minute hike between the spaces. And equally, the world of the private sector and all those discussions that were happening in some of the side events were not connecting in any way to what was happening in the negotiating room. And so you had a very split process that year. Nothing really to do with Fiji's presidency, but very much to do with the way of the, space constraints. And then we had Egypt a couple of years ago, which this, you probably came across this in some of the media. The signage was incorrect, space was confusing, everyone was lost. There was other, human rights issues I'll talk about in a sec, about other, pitfalls around COP presidencies, but no one could find where they had to be. Everything got delayed. Nothing happened on time. Negotiators weren't there. It was a frustrating process, and that translated right through to the outcome. So a really interesting point to sort of, particularly from an Australia hosting perspective, of how important it is to get the physical layout. It sounds like just logistics, but it permeates the policy, the political outcomes so much. And it's sort of fascinating to track the really successful COPs. Do the legwork on getting that layout right. They think about it, they put time into it, and others that can't or aren't able to. And we see the results in terms of the outcomes that the mainstream community reads in the media, I think. So I want to touch on this one. I think outside the negotiating room, just very quickly, talking about how NGOs and advocacy groups use this space to influence what's going on in the negotiating rooms. Negotiating rooms themselves are only governments. It's party-to-party negotiation, but this broader marketplace and the spaces within that become really important for influencing what's going on and calling to attention what's happening in those rooms. And I think one of the slightly cringy, but actually quite effective, I don't know if anyone's heard of Fossil of the Day. So the global climate civil society advocacy network Climate Action Network. That is the peak body for all NGOs globally, I think, that work on climate. Every day have this very gaudy display in this marketplace type portion of the COP around fossil of the day. And they vote as to which country has been the most problematic for what reason. And there was a long period where Australia pretty much got fossil of the day almost every day. And then at the end of the COP would get the most colossal fossil. So it's silly in a way, but I think it highlights the degrees of what is happening in these spaces and the very different tactics that are being used to generate climate policy and political outcomes, from like a dinosaur skeleton suit on one end to some of the stuff that Angelique's going to talk about. So it's just one thing that, again, if you're not there, I don't think many people think. And there's, you know, behind this, there's just like hundreds of people gathering, watching that, and lots of media, and it often makes the news and can be very effective in terms of pushing that country to be a little bit better on something else the following day. So we've talked about what a COP is, how the design, the organisation really influences the outcomes, and how important that dynamic is. But I wanted to touch very briefly on the impact of some of the benefits to hosting a COP. These are true for every country, but I have tailored them a little bit, again, utilising the framework for this, which is, you know, if Australia hosts, what is the impact that this has in terms of policy? I think we know about the impact, or the supposed impacts of COPs on shifting international climate policy, but what's in it in terms of what are the stakes climate post country? And there's been quite a bit of research done on this for individual COP presidencies, but also more broadly, if you're interested, you can certainly dig in to that. But typically the host country always comes out with new climate policy, whether that's sort of a national, you know, climate policy, significant advances around renewable energy. There's some great recent examples. COP26 in Glasgow that I mentioned earlier. The UK announced a whole host of new policies as a result of that, assuming the mantle in terms of the host of the COP, and this concept of sort of leading from the front. If the COP presidency is really ambitious, they pull everyone else with them. So it can be, in terms of like domestic climate advocacy, incredibly useful to use this COP presidency and the host to generate a lot of much needed political and policy momentum around climate change. And for Australia, this could be really critical. If we host the COP, I think everyone's very aware of where we've been for the last 10, 12 years in terms of ambitious climate policy. This could be a game changer for us in terms of making some real progress and elevating climate up the political agenda, because of that reputational risk, I suppose, that they have to have things to show up and to bring others on board through that COP process. So yeah, the UK included a legally binding target in terms of net zero emissions by 2050 as part of their presidency in 2026. COP24, Poland really used their presidency and the climate policy that they created around that to focus on just transition out of a historical reliance on coal, coming back to sort of the value of not only how you structure your COP space, but which city and location you choose to actually host that conference in within your country can be really important to send signals as well and communicate with the people that are flying in, those 30,000 people. What are your priorities? What are your challenges? What are you struggling with? So COP24 was hosted in, I can't remember Katowice, which is one of the biggest cities coal producing. So you literally were driving to the center and you could see the coal stacks. There was visibility issues when you were there because of the smoke. So that was a real sort of issue of or tactic of soft diplomacy to remind everyone that this was an issue for Poland. And I think that played into not only the policy that they used to advance through the negotiations, but to really shine a spotlight on this concept of just transition. Going back a few years, COP16 in Mexico used their COP presidency to advance probably one of the first domestic climate change laws for any developing country. Hugely significant as a result of their COP presidency. So lots of new policy, lots of legislation typically accompanies a COP host, and I think Australia could expect the same, and using that as a real push for increased ambition and increased money being put on the table domestically as well as in the region and for climate priorities as a result of the presidency host. It's also an economic opportunity. My example of the Olympics earlier, that's true for, these are very resource intensive, but they generate a lot of local income. Interesting fact for the UNFCCC is all jobs have to be local. So there's a huge local economic boon as a result of hosting, again, like the, sports analogies and things like that. Also a huge cost. And I'll talk about sort of some of the cities that Australia's thinking about in a sec. For Australia in particular, this is something I neglected to mention at the start, but will come very important later on. When Australia put its hand up to host COP31, it did so on the basis that it would do so in partnership with the Pacific. This is the first time, I think I mentioned this, the first time for the region to actually, anyone in the region to actually physically host, but is the first time in the 29, or by that point, 31 years of having COPs that there's been any kind of joint COP that really is focused on building that regional partnership model. There's been lots of countries that have sort of shared pre-COP and post-COP, but this, at least Australia's bid, is to do it in partnership and in collaboration and use this as an opportunity to advance key regional priorities and issues. So in terms of regional benefits, a real opportunity for Australia to strengthen ties with the Pacific. That has been a real issue again over the last 10 years. With that comes increased security, building trust, building stronger relationships and allies is very much front of mind in terms of foreign policy. So some of the benefits of COP go far beyond climate policy and climate politics and really start to get into a country mapping out what it needs in terms of foreign policy and how it can utilise that COP presidency and the process to do so. And Australia's decision, I think, to do it in partnership with the Pacific obviously will strengthen its bid, but I think has a lot of these sort of foreign policy and regional security issues underpinning it. I think that is tactically quite clever to try to use the COP to strengthen it's a real priority outside of climate for Australia. And trade opportunities. I'll talk to this a bit in a sec, depending on sort of the policy priorities that Australia wants to advance. There's the opportunity to really structure this COP and the presidency priorities around Australia being a key exporter to the Pacific of a lot of the technologies, the know-how in terms of renewable energy and climate. So I think there's trade dimensions, potential trade dimensions to this as well. And some of the international benefits, the reputation one, as I mentioned, I think is a real driving force here. If Australia gets this, it is an opportunity to come out of the dark years of Australia's reputation. In the international space, it hasn't been good for a very long time. This can go a long way in changing this if done well. COPs come with it, potential improved diplomatic access. Australia is not a member of the G7, for instance. The G7 typically is countries that are reasonably ambitious on climate change, that like to form a club. I think Germany has formed sort of a climate club within the G7. I think there's opportunities for Australia in taking this sort of really leading international role to play in some of those fora and gain access to some of those fora, again, to advance issues that are probably quite outside the climate remit. But it's a tactically strong choice. And a strengthened diplomatic network. I think we've seen this most effectively used by the UK in terms of COP26 in Glasgow, really spent a long time building their international network, building up their embassies, having dedicated climate funds to fund projects in priority areas and countries, hiring a ton of people to build this climate network globally to support the COP, but that very much remains in place and strengthens their local relationships, their local intel gathering. So huge, again, foreign policy outcomes through an investment that's largely driven through the climate process. So turning now to COP31, conscious of time, and the significance of this COP31 presidency. And some of this we'll touch on right at the end in terms of how Australia's, if it hosts, can use this COP not only for its own advantage, but really to sort of shape the future of the UNFCCC. And sorry for my crude diagram, but hopefully this makes sense. So we've got Australia COP31 in the middle, 2026. This is where we are now, as Azerbaijan. Next year, we've got Brazil hosting. Now, Brazil has come out already. It's hosting in the Amazon. It will have a strong focus on forests, reforestation, nature-based solutions. I mentioned sort of the location really important. Brazil is reminding everyone of the importance of forests. Everyone will be traveling to the middle of the Amazon. So that will be immediately preceding ours, potentially. And then afterwards, Africa will be hosting. Now, Africa typically focus on things like resilience, food security, land-based climate actions. So you can start to see the rhythm of some of these issues that could be picked up, that this could be, particularly given that Australia is hosting this with the Pacific, a really important opportunity to bring some of the coastal and ocean dynamics in terms of that climate policy thematic focus, bringing in some of the issues raised by Brazil in terms of Indigenous people's knowledge and participation and integration into the process. And again, bringing that into an Australian and Pacific context, but then feeds into some of those resilience issues picked up by Africa. So quite a nice thematic focus. Also, if we get it, that will be 3 COPs, I think, for the first time ever, that will be hosted in the southern part of the continent, rather than the northern. And so I think there's some nice things that could be brought out. So COPs sort of happen within this global framework, but also what happens internally in the climate space. We have the G20 and the issues that will be raised by South Africa. The US, as presence of those 2 processes, being incredibly influential to Australia, but then internally, it's going to be a really interesting time for the movement of the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. Those of you that may not follow the Paris Agreement really closely, it's all cyclical. So every 5 years, countries submit nationally determined contributions, increase their ambition. They're expected to increase their ambition. There's then a global stock-taking process to assess project progress. And I'll get to finance in a sec. Leading into Paris, the next round of NDCs are expected to be communicated in 2025 from the lead up to Brazil. These things never run on schedule. We'll probably have a decent picture of where ambition is heading into Brazil, but probably the better picture of where we are on ambition will be leading into Australia's presidency. I think we're currently heading for a trajectory of 2.7 degrees. So really overshooting both the 2-degree goal and the 1.5-degree goal. But coming into the Australian COP, that picture around 1.5 being potentially out of reach will really crystallise. And if this is a COP as an large ocean state that Australia is hosting with other large ocean states in the Pacific, that messaging and how Australia uses that to increase ambition or to shift focus to things like loss and damage and adaptation finance could be really critical. On that again later. The other thing in terms of where that we are in the cycle is we will have a new quantified goal on finance, hopefully by the end of this year, that will be very influential next year, as well as clarity around the target of doubling adaptation finance. So the next couple of years, really critical in terms of setting up that framework for what we do for the next 5 or 10. It's the end of what I'm going to talk about, and I'll hand over to Angelique. I've touched on a lot of this already, but what could an Australia Pacific Regional COP look like for those working in the space? What are some of the policy objectives, thematic priorities that might be relevant or strategic for Australia and the Pacific to advance. Based on what I was just talking through, I think it's highly likely this becomes a bit of a crisis COP in terms of the movement generally, and how this COP will tackle that narrative and how that presidency in a partnership with the Pacific manages that in a way that reflects everyone's views, I think will be incredibly critical, and if done well, as I said, can really shape future policymaking. Australia could really choose to take up the mantle of the ocean and coasts theme. This has been slightly cursed. I think I mentioned this. The only ocean-based COPs that countries have tried to hold recently was Fiji. They couldn't bring everyone to Fiji, so they had it in Bonn. It's hard to talk about the ocean when you're in the middle of Germany. It just doesn't resonate. We had a second crack a couple of years later. Chile put their hand up, a real leader on oceans, I think the world's longest coastline, had civil unrest, so had to pull out I think a month before. It quickly shifted to Madrid. Again, we're just not getting that sort of coastal ocean vibe. So if Australia wants to go down that path, thinking back to sort of what I was talking about earlier, where they have that could be really instrumental in bringing home some of the realities of what large ocean states, coastal populations are facing in terms of climate impacts, as well as the opportunities and solutions that these coastal states bring. I think there will be a huge Indigenous participation and Indigenous-led climate solution focus, but particularly so picking up from Brazil and hopefully leading into Africa if they choose to sort of continue that multi-presidency focus. And 1.5 alignment for fossil fuels. This has been something that Pacific small island developing states have been asking for, particularly from Australia, for a very long time as the main exporter of fossil fuels in the region. Australia would go a long way to being able to really advance a package of commitments, phasing down fossil fuels, looking at subsidies, making some meaningful action around fossil fuels for the region and aligning that with the course of 1.5. Nature Positive, Australia is obviously hosting the Nature Positive Summit later this year in Sydney, really looking at bringing together the climate biodiversity with the finance angle. This could be another nice pickup again for a large ocean state where a lot of our solutions have strong biodiversity and nature elements to it. Regional technology transfer, again, this will be critical for a Pacific Australia partnership that Australia would and then lead sort of a coalition around really trying to get that technology transfer to SIDS and LDCs and others to help them leapfrog some of these steps. And we'll touch on that one a little bit later as well. That could become a really interesting blueprint for future regional COPs that try to advance meaningful coalitions, meaningful partnerships to achieve things at scale, move beyond sort of just individual country-led priorities to more transboundary action, and really starting to break down the developing country divide that has persisted, but doing so in a way that is genuine and that builds trust and that builds collective action. That's enough from me. I will hand over to Angelique to talk about the other side of COPs.
Alrighty, morning everyone. So the other side of COPs. So as Eliza's already mentioned, we have this sort of marketplace, lots of moving around, side events, everybody's there, and rightly so, right? Climate change needs everyone to get a good solution. But of course, the text is actually negotiated by parties to the UNFCCC, as well as the Paris Agreement. And parties are government officials, and we are in these rooms very often brought together to come and agree a decision text. But of course, I like to, and I think you may have heard of this a lot, liken it to 197 countries or 197 people trying to agree what we're going to have for dinner. Somebody's allergic to shrimp. Somebody really wants rice. Somebody really wants chicken, and somebody's vegetarian. And we somehow have to choose where we're going to go for dinner. But this time it's 197. Right? Now, what we have here is a picture of the champions and the coalitions that exist within the process. No, it's a bit small, or maybe it's my glasses, but it looks a bit small here. But there are different groups, right? Different coalitions. You have your umbrella group, which is the group that Australia is a member of. And here typically you have Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, the United States, and they work together. And I think more recently, when the UK left the EU, they joined the umbrella group. And so then you've got the EU, and they're typically seen as Annex 1 countries, right? And I want to touch a little bit about what is these annexes, because it will link later on into our conversation about finance. So Annex 1 countries are countries which at the time in 1992, when we were designing the UNFCCC convention, were those who were going to provide the money. And non-Annex ones are going to be the ones who receive the money, right? Now, as a huge block, typically the non-Annex 1, with some exceptions, the poor, the unclassified, the middle ground. We have the G77 in China, that is the biggest block, about over 140 countries, developing countries who negotiate as a block. And in 1992, they had a lot in common, the need for finance. That is still the thread that keeps the G77 and China together. But of course, they all look very different right now, right? So you have the Alliance of Small Island States, which are all the SIDS from the Pacific, the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, as well as the Caribbean. And then at the same time, in the same group, you have other major economies that today are major economies, may not have been in 1992, but are major economies, and they all form part of the same negotiating bloc. So obviously there are things that we cannot agree together in this bloc, right? But the one thing that still holds true is the desire to be recipients of finance, or at least not the providers of finance. So these are the different negotiating blocs. In terms of the Pacific, of course, the small island developing states as part of AOSIS, but just to mention that within AOSIS, the PSIDS, the Pacific SIDS, do also confer as a bloc. So what typically happens is the Pacific SIDS would come together and agree positions, and then they would bring it up to AOSIS, and then AOSIS would have to agree the position with the other members of the SIDS grouping. Right? So these are blocks, and basically this is effectiveness and efficiency, right? Instead of getting 197 people to decide what to have for dinner, I'm just sending my representative. On behalf of all the vegetarians, please fight to get a restaurant where we'll be able to have vegetarian food. I'm not actually vegetarian, so, but this is about effectiveness and efficiency, but also really important to highlight that negotiating is very taxing, and typically small island developing states, especially the Pacific, have very small delegations. So as you can imagine, this is just a more efficient way to negotiate. Now, when it comes to negotiations, drama is always guaranteed. Always. Of different levels, different proportions, but always guaranteed. And it's really the typical structure of a day for negotiations. You start with your negotiating block, right? You then, so let's say AOSIS, the PSIDS would start as AOSIS. They then go into a G77 negotiating block, because they then need to negotiate with the bigger group. And then negotiations start from 10 to 1. We pretend to have lunch from 1 to 3. That never actually happens. I've never seen it. And then the official end of the day is at 6 o'clock. I can assure you, we are in these rooms until 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, sometimes 4 in the morning. But the official end time of a negotiation day is 6 p.m. So that's the general structure of the negotiations. This is what it looks like per day. In a 2-week time frame, you have 1 day rest. And inevitably always goes into overtime. And you'll see a lot of that in the media at the end of the year where it's like, we've gone into overtime again. 6 hours, 24 hours, whatever it is. And I think the one thing I want to highlight is in negotiations, not everybody is there to address climate change at the UNFCCC. And I think that's really important to think about, right? Not everyone is there to address climate change. Everyone has different priorities. And some people, I'm pretty sure, are just playing chess. I'm almost certain of it, that they're there for the strategic intellectual maneuvering rather than addressing climate change. So that's another facet that I think we always have to remember in this process of negotiations. But at the end of the day, it's all about the words. And the next couple of slides that I'm going to touch on is more about strategies and tactics. And I want to weave a little bit about equity as we think about these negotiations. Completely artificial, right? I will fly from a COP 31, I don't know where I'll be, probably flying from New York. I will fly from New York to Australia with a 15-hour time difference, and I will be expected to get started to work on the next day. Completely artificial setting, right? Nowhere in the world do you expect to be completely up and running on the next day of arrival from a COP. So this is something to think about. And of course, you're away from your family, you're away from your life for about 2 weeks where you're dedicated to this process. So I just want us to think a little bit about that experience as well, not just about space and in addition to space and the commutes between rooms, but also people are tired, suffering from real jet lag, right? But they're all going to be expected to negotiate on words and text, right? And I just want to highlight a little bit here about, sort of the fundamentals, the starting point of negotiations. When do you use may? When do you use should? Shall. Shall is your, legal obligations. But of course, just because you see shall doesn't mean it is a legal obligation, right? If it is followed by a verb that is to endeavor, to strive, then of course, it's not as concrete of a legal obligation as we think. And then you have to think of whether you have your and or, whether it is should, so you're encouraged, but you don't have to, or whether it's discretionary, it's a may, right? So countries are really, and of course, in most negotiations, parties agree to have observers in the rooms. And when you hear the conversations outside, then oftentimes they'll say, oh, these government officials arguing about arguing about shall, should, but of course, super important, right? You are deciding whether there is a legal obligation versus something completely discretionary. But I think the one thing that I want to highlight in this entire process is this equity piece of English is not everyone's first language, but they are expected to work in this language, right? So you have an entire group, I should know this, Seychelles is both Commonwealth and Francophone, I should know. But you have an entire group of Francophone countries who are French speaking, but are expected to negotiate in English, right? And this is used as a tactic as well, where you will hear certain negotiators say, I'm from an English speaking country, and I'm telling you it should be should. When in fact, another group of countries may be actually trying to get a shall. But the lever is, I know English, and I'm telling you how the words should be used, right? And these are quite inequitable strategies that are there. I suppose I should recognize that the Francophonie is trying to support their negotiators more to be able to navigate that. But I think it's something to always recognize. And I do think that countries like Australia, like Canada, play a critical role as being English speakers, but being aware of the equity issues and trying to be a neutral broker. Where, they're coming in and saying, I can help with the drafting of the text because I'm an English native speaker, but willing to listen and not only write what is advantageous to their country, but actually bridge the divide. Right? So this is done by very few countries, but it is done as well. I'm not going to go, I'm not going to play this because I'm not sure it's going to play, but essentially this is the closing plenary. It was a video of the closing plenary of COP 28, where parties were going to adopt the COP 28 decision. And the alliance of the small island states was not in the room. And adoption took place. And after, so when they walked in, when Anne walked in, the lead negotiator walked in, she walked into a standing ovation. It wasn't for her. It was for the adoption of the text, but AOSIS hadn't actually finished coordinating to say that they were willing to adopt the text. So they subsequently took the mic and said, we're quite surprised. We've walked into a room giving a standing ovation to the adoption of the text, but we weren't here. And they then said they didn't have any intention of stopping the adoption, but these are all the issues they have with the text. Right? And the reason I wanted to play this for you, and you can have a look at it, it's on the closing plenary, I think it's 1 minute, 19 seconds in, is just to say that there are also ways of using procedure to bypass equity as well, right? Actually, even though Anne wasn't in the room, there was quorum. Right? So the adoption could have taken place procedurally. But then there's a question around this equity piece, because other than AOSIS speaking out, no one else said, hey guys, the AOSIS chair is not in the room. Right? Something that could have been done by the COP president, the secretariat, and many others. Right? So just to think about that responsibility of a smooth adoption also involve these elements. So when it comes to tactics and strategies, there are different ways of how these are used. Sometimes they're used positively, sometimes they're not. But there is, and I'm going to go through a few examples. I don't have time to tell all the stories, but we'll go through a few examples. What makes people feel comfortable, right? Because even though you're accustomed to hanging out with your own maybe geographical regional group, or I feel comfortable hanging out with all the islanders, that's not how we're going to reach consensus. We're going to get all 197 to agree to where we're going to dinner. So how do we make people feel comfortable? How do we connect with others? And here there is an element of using linguistic and cultural familiarity, right? So there are groups that there is just an element of, we all speak French, we all speak Arabic, whatever it is, and we're culturally more similar and it feels more familiar. So people tend to group together that way. Doesn't mean we're going to have consensus, right? So there is a need to think about how we then use coalitions. And coalitions, yes, have typically been based on regional, geographic regional basis, but there can be cross-regional effective coalitions. And I'm sure, you know, Eliza was part of this as well. When we were working on the Ocean and Climate Nexus, it was developed countries, developing countries all working together to see how we could bring in the ocean into the UNFCCC process, right? So these cross-border coalitions, also very important. And then you've got this element of regional allies, which I think will be very relevant for Australia. And regional allies can be positive and negative, right? You could have a regional ally that calls you up and says, stop being so ambitious. Or you could have a regional ally that puts enough pressure on you to make sure you are ambitious. All right, so those are different strategies that could also be used. One very effective one, though, is fatigue, right? It's called negotiating by fatigue. So it's when you kind of draw out the negotiation until late in the night, and when people want to go home, they will agree. Promise you, they will agree. Because they want to go home. And also because delegations are so different and they have access to very different things. So you have developed I shouldn't say all, but some developed country parties who will come and, you know, they will have buses bringing food for them at around midnight so they can make sure they can continue to fuel up, or their delegations are big enough for somebody else to swap out. Whereas you will have smaller delegations who are just tired and hungry and want to go home. They will agree. Right? So there is an element of negotiation by fatigue that is used quite frequently. And then you can have the use of procedure. I spoke about quorum. I also think that there's a lot of delay tactics in this process where you have to kind of say, I need to check with my head of delegation. I need to go back to capital, which is sort of your capital city or your base, for me to get instructions on whether I can agree to this. And then you can also use coalitions. You're like, I can't make any decisions unless all the members of AOSIS are here, otherwise I cannot make any decisions, right? So there are different ways that these tools can be used. But now I think it's also important to think about how the marketplace actually comes together, right? Even though negotiations are happening inside a particular zone, there is civil society allies. And this fossil award, so effective. I remember it wasn't Australia, it was New Zealand. And, you know, they said, can you believe it? We were the fossil of the day today. You know, like it actually works. And they really start to think about what they need to adjust, right? So many times government officials from certain negotiating blocks do work with civil society to put pressure on their domestic context. Because, and I mean, not as a matter of course, but it may be that the COP presidency doesn't particularly get influenced by what a delegate from the Seychelles wants, but will be very influenced by what their domestic population wants. Right? So I think this is something else to think about as we think about the Australian COP presidency. The other thing, which this one's one of my favorites, it's having a big political and finance announcement outside the negotiating room to influence what happens inside the negotiating room. So you'll have somebody take the mic and say, right now, my Secretary of State, my minister is making an announcement right now, going to donate X million grants to Africa. And this is supposed to then create flexibility inside the negotiation room. I'm not saying it always works, but it's certainly a tool that is utilized. And you have the rumor mill. Sorry, I live in New York. This is you there. So they've got the rumor mill where spreading chaos and sowing distrust is another very effective way of breaking up coalitions, right? Because you could be very effective and very strong as a coalition, but when a chair gets a phone call and says one of your members about to break group positions, the coalition is no longer as effective, right? Because now there's distrust, you don't know who's going where. And then finally, another very similar to this one is, I will give you something in another policy arena so that you're flexible on climate. So for example, if the Pacific really care about the ocean, I will give you a declaration that says your exclusive economic zone remains the same despite climate change, which is treated as an ocean issue in return for flexibility. Right, so those are all tactics that are used. I'll touch very quickly on this because we don't have a lot of time, but there's also an element of gender and culture, and I'll just speak to it very briefly. It's 197 people from 197 different countries, right? Everybody has their own culture, and everybody perceives each other in different ways. And one of the things that I find really interesting is how our own biases can start to affect who we hear and who we pay attention to. So in the negotiations, when the person who sounds like perhaps the professor that taught me at university, because I'm in tune to listen to somebody who educated me and I would take more seriously, all of a sudden I'm paying a lot of attention. If somebody has perhaps a very heavy accent from some other place and I find it difficult to understand, switch off. What that means is we're losing really valuable input from people because we're allowing our own biases to start to influence us. Right? Or the belief that if somebody's educated in a certain country, they know more than someone who's been educated in another country. So these are things that are perceptions and biases that you have to be very conscious of as you navigate the process, but then always remember, how do people see you? Because they have it too, right? And that's always very, very tricky. And we can have a whole conversation about, how to make sure you are seen. And, if you do have an accent, what are the tools that you should have? What are the tools you should use to make sure that you're slowing down your pace, you're making sure you've grabbed people's attention. So there's a whole lot of engagement around that, but I think I'll stop there. But just to say, very important for us to think about how we see others and how that's influencing who we hear and see, and then how others see us. Eliza and I are going to run through this together, which is going to be very fun.
We're a long way over time
Okay.
now, unfortunately. So yeah, we might. Thank you very much. If people have to go, then stand. If not, then please raise your hand if you have any questions for either Eliza or Angelique. And I think we'll be sticking around. Have any questions or queries? Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. It was absolutely fascinating, and someone's always kind of known about COPs, but kind of getting that fine granular detail. Got a bit of a hypothetical question for you. So you talk about what Australia would do if it has COPs, and potentially what Australia would do. And I imagine when you imply Australia, a bunch of different actors, but probably the federal government's quite a driver. And I guess there's a temporal aspect that there's a federal election in between now and the next COP, with a potential government coming in that's still, say, ideologically attached to when policy areas when Australia was a climate prior area. So has there been a COP in the past where there's been a reluctant host of a COP due to election cycles? Or what could be the implications of that, having a reluctant COP host?
Brazil.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the Brazil example?
I mean, it's very faint memory in my mind, but there was the case of Brazil where the intention was for them to host a COP. And then, but there was always this same dynamic about there's an election between the nomination and the hosting of the COP. And then, of course, Bolsonaro actually won that election, and they had to, and he withdrew.
They didn't go ahead.
Yeah, they didn't go ahead in the end, but of course we'll have a COP next year in Brazil.
I don't think Australia would actually withdraw. I don't think but I think it would. No, I can't think of any exact whether you've had such a different ideological change that we might have in Australia, because most other countries are not quite as split. But I think you would just have a COP that is not as effective. Like there's many COPs that are not effective. And a lot of, particularly what I was talking about, is either how to have an effective one or the impact of an effective one. But you can have, Egypt in a way was ineffective from that perspective. And I didn't actually talk on some of the human rights and participation issues that plagued that COP, but was again a real cautionary tale that it's not all rosy for a COP presidency. Just because you've assumed the climate mantle does not mean that reputation will be improved. And Egypt really saw that because of the way they handled human rights and students and participation that really overshadowed any climate outcomes. And so I'm not saying that that's what Australia would experience, but it's a reputational risk for us if we don't feel confident that we're going to get a government in that at least can carry it forward in a way, particularly given the Pacific dynamic. But no, I can't think of any exact example where there's been a change and there's been stretching my knowledge, but I'm sure there is. But it would definitely change
Imagine, yeah.
the outcomes, and I think change how you would have to organise outside, sort of what Angelique was talking about, and how Australian civil society and regional civil society would have to mobilise to keep that pressure on the government to get something out and to make it as effective as possible, and probably develop very different alliances globally. You would see a lot of pressure from different allies of Australia, I think, come to bear, depending on where the US is also, potentially. Where the UK is. The UK is a slightly more stable partner, but, you know, and particularly highlighting what Angelique said in the sense that bargaining chips would change. It's not all within the climate, the bucket of tools. You would have other deals being made by the countries that want a strong COP and that have those levers to pull on Australia, and it wouldn't be climate levers, it would be trade, and it would be broader foreign policy. So you would see different constellations. You'd see a lot of behind the scenes diplomatic action to get something, I think, but it certainly may not hit all the notes that it could hit with a government that was really going in committed to climate ambition. Or it could be, you know, they could use it again to just highlight all the ways that Australia can't take action. You know, they could have it at a coal mine, perhaps. They could take the they could take the Katowice approach, and we could be camped out in a coal mine with coal workers and really, or nuclear, you know, so you can play it many different ways. Yeah, good question.
Other questions?
Sorry for going over.
No, it's all right. I've got some more questions, but maybe we'll leave them till after. There's tea or coffee out there? Yeah.
And we are around if anyone wants to follow up over email, and we enjoy this topic, as you can probably see. So,
And likewise,
happy to
do look on our website and join our community for ICRR if you want to come to future seminars or workshops or activities. So thank you again. It's a fascinating deep dive into the COP process. Let's hope we do get COP in Australia.
let's hope we do. We will. Yeah. We
All
can
right,
run
thank
one
you very
next year on Turkey.
No, that's all right. That's good.
Diane.
Huh?
You know Diane.
Question with Rahman. What actually?
I mentioned in early.
Yes, of course. I've been in Finland. Yeah. Then that was all the negotiations going on. Hey, Lynn. See you. How are things?
Whole lot of stuff. Good, thank you, yeah. President Glenn, working with Eliza, Angelique, and Angelique very, very lately, she just joined us.
Michelle,
Yeah.
MBA intern working with us with this 31.
Yeah. That's really no doubt.